As we drove down the highway, I watched as the sign for Silver Lake Park came and went. "There's the sign. We're almost there," Georgia yelled, already starting to collect her items and put them back into her backpack. She'd been urging all of us to plan a weekend camping trip for months, and after some pleading and convincing, we caved. Georgia had always been the outdoorsy type. Having grown up out in the country, she was always gardening, camping, and fishing. But after moving to the city for school, those activities were a little less accessible. She'd always told us stories of her and her family going camping, walking the trails, having campfires, swimming and fishing in the lakes, and seeing all kinds of wild animals. I always thought it sounded fun. I'd done some hiking and went camping once when I was little with my dad and brother. I enjoyed it, but it had been a while since. A couple of the other girls weren't as enthused. Haley and Mel were more or less indifferent. They'd never done anything like that before, but seemed relatively interested to try. Laura, on the other hand, couldn't be less interested. She hated bugs, thought dirt was disgusting, and became an absolute menace if she had to go more than a day without showering. I don't mean to fall on stereotypes, but she fit the ticket when it came to your typical high-maintenance, big city-raised girl. She was confident, demanding, and dramatic. But despite her nose being too high in the air sometimes, she was an incredible friend. So incredible that, in seeing how excited Georgia was about the trip, even though the thought of having to sleep in a tent made her nauseous, she agreed to come with us on the trip. It was about a 2-hour drive from the city to the park we had booked our campsite at. Being students, I was the only one with a car. Naturally, this left the driving to me. Georgia was in the passenger seat, yapping on about all the fun things ahead of us on our 3-day excursion. Throughout the drive, I would catch the eye of Mel or Haley in the rearview mirror, and we'd give a little smile at each other, shaking our heads in amusement at George's enthusiastic ramblings. Laura was pretty quiet during the drive, but we could tell she was really trying to be excited. Finally, we turned into the small parking lot. We all stumbled out of the car, stretching our legs and gathering our packs. I volunteered to carry the tent with Georgia, since it was in a large, cumbersome bag. We ended up getting one of those big 6-person tents. Mel grabbed the cooking supplies and Haley carried the cooler with all of our drinks, and Laura was left to carry the food itself. Once everyone was situated with their gear and camping supplies, we locked up the car and made our way to the entrance to the trails. There were 5 campsites in this area. We were booked in at Pine Flats, about a 30-minute hike in from the parking lot. We double-checked we had everything, and entered into the shaded trail. There was a main trail that began at the parking lot that eventually branched off to lead to each campsite. The trails were well kept but relatively narrow, so we had to hike in a single-file line. Georgia led, obviously, then it was me, then Mel, then Haley, and Laura at the end. We chatted and played music as we navigated the trails to our campsite. About 20 minutes in, we started hearing some complaints from the back of the line. Laura was slowing down, mumbling something under her breath. Haley had turned to ask her if she was okay, but Laura kind of brushed her off, saying that her feet were starting to hurt and she felt a blister pop on her heel. Haley assured her we were almost at the site and we kept moving. It wasn't even noon and it was already a scorching hot day. The trees around the trail provided some relief from the sun, but the hot and humid air was inescapable. After a few more minutes of walking, Georgia turned and called back to us, almost as if she could sense how uncomfortable we all were, that there was a lake right beside our campsite. This was enough motivation for us to pick up the pace. We came to a small bridge that crossed a mid-sized pond. As we reached the other side, we heard some rustling in the brush beside us. I glanced over expecting to see a rabbit or even a deer, but instead I saw Laura climbing down the bank towards the pond. I stopped, effectively halting Mel and Haley as well. "Laura, what are you doing?" I called out to her. "My feet are on fire and this stupid blister popped. It's bleeding a bit and hurts like a bitch. I'm just gonna rinse them in the pond super quick and cool them off," she yelled back. Georgia quickly squeezed past me on the trail, approaching the bank. "Laura, I wouldn't do that. Stagnant pond water is really gross. There could be a lot of bacteria and stuff in there. We're close to the campsite. Just wait like 5 more minutes and we can all go swimming in the lake," she said. "I'll be like 2 seconds. Plus, this water looks like crystal clear," Laura said back. I peered over the bank and realized she was right. I don't think I've ever seen a pond so clear, although there was an almost orange tinge to the water. "You guys keep walking, I'll catch up," she said. "All right, don't be too long," Georgia stuttered. We continued walking. Shortly after, we reached the campsite and began getting our things set up while we waited for Laura. Georgia and I were on tent duty, and Mel and Haley were getting the cooking supplies organized. Eventually, Laura came waltzing into camp and we all got changed to go swimming. The rest of the day was actually really fun. We swam for most of the afternoon and did some sun tanning on the little sand beach. We finished setting up camp and snacked on some jerky and trail mix. Once the sun started to set, we began making a fire to cook dinner, a gourmet meal of hot dogs and corn on the cob. We were all buzzing around the fire getting food and drinks and talking about what we wanted to do the next day. We noticed Laura was being really quiet, kind of staring blankly into the fire. "Laura, you good?" Mel asked. "Yeah, I'm fine. I'm just really tired," she said lazily without looking up from the fire. "Okay, well, let us know if we can get you anything," Georgia added. Laura nodded her head. The rest of us continued on drinking and talking. A couple hours later, we thought it would be fun to go night swimming at the lake. We all got changed and asked Laura if she wanted to join us. "No, I'm gonna go to bed," Laura said rather flatly. As she said this, she stood up and turned to face us more. Honestly, I was a little taken aback. Maybe it was just the shadow from the fire, but she looked pale and almost gaunt. "Damn, Laura, are you sure you're okay?" I asked. "Yes, Sophia, I'm fine. I'm just tired, okay?" She snapped back. She had a strange sharpness in her eyes. "Okay, well, we'll be at the lake if you need anything," I replied cautiously. Laura didn't say anything and just turned and walked towards the tent. We all looked at each other concerned, but thought it best that we give her space. She could be a bit of a diva sometimes, but rarely would she snap at us like that. We just assumed it was a mix of a long day in the sun, the fact that she probably wanted to be anywhere else but out here, and maybe a bad hot dog or two. We made our way to the lake and swam for another couple hours, then walked back to camp and got ready to go to sleep. We were all very careful to move quietly in the tent, as to not wake Laura. She was sleeping on the far side of the tent facing the wall. She didn't move or say anything, so it seemed she was out cold. Soon enough, so were the rest of us. I'm not sure what time I woke up, but it was still pitch black out. Some kind of noise broke me out of my dream. It sounded like a yell or a grunt, but I couldn't place exactly what it was. I sat up on my elbows and squinted around the tent, trying to get my eyes to adjust. The sleeping arrangements went myself, Georgia, Mel, Haley, then Laura at the far side. As my eyes adjusted, I noticed that Laura and Haley were gone. They must have gone to the bathroom. Maybe one of them tripped or saw an animal or something. I laid back down and closed my eyes. But I couldn't get back to sleep. Something was stirring in the back of my mind. A bad feeling. But why? Several minutes later, I heard the tent unzip and footsteps stepping back over to the far side of the tent. The concerning part was, I only heard one set of footsteps. I looked over without sitting up and saw a figure climbing back into their sleeping bag. But was that Haley or Laura? I was about to say something but realized whoever hadn't returned was probably still using the bathroom and would be back soon. I settled myself, closed my eyes again, and fell asleep. A little while later, I was startled awake by a hand on my arm. I jumped and my eyes darted around, soon landing on Georgia. "I gotta go to the bathroom, can you come with me?" she whispered. I mumbled back, still half asleep, and realized I needed to go as well. We tiptoed out of the tent and made our way into the trees, grabbing our jackets and flashlights from our packs on the way. We stepped through the forest, careful to watch for rocks and roots in the ground. After a couple minutes, we got to the old outhouse. I told Georgia she could go first, so she hopped into the outhouse and closed the door. I took some steps away and went down a small hill so she could have a bit of privacy. You really don't realize how dark nighttime is until you're standing alone in the middle of a forest. There's no streetlights, and not even the stars or moon reach the forest floor. It was virtually pitch black. I shined my flashlight around, looking at the treetops and further out into the forest. It was a spotlight slicing through the darkness. Staring out into the void, I started to get a weird feeling. Maybe I'd watched too many scary movies or was letting my mind play tricks on me, but I was getting the sense that I was being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck started standing up, and I was beginning to sweat. I reasoned it was just because I wasn't used to being in this kind of environment. I wasn't used to this sense of isolation. I tried to shake it off, and I turned to walk back towards the outhouse. I stopped in my tracks. With my flashlight pointed at the ground, I caught a glimmer of something on the forest floor. It looked thick and red. I took a cautious step forward, unable to take my eyes off the spot. It was a trickling run of something, coming from the small hill where the outhouse was placed. It looked like blood. My heart rate picked up. Why would there be blood? I scanned the surrounding area with my flashlight and noticed the trail growing larger as I looked further up the slope to the outhouse. I slowly followed it, careful to not step in it. "Georgia," I whispered hoarsely. No response. I walked closer and called again. "Georgia," I said a little louder. Still nothing. I tried once more on the brink of yelling. "Georgia, answer me!" Suddenly, the door swung open and I almost jumped out of my skin. "Geez, can a girl pee in peace?" she joked, motioning for me to use the outhouse next. I stood in place, sighing in relief but not really responding to what she said. "Soph, what's up? Didn't you say you had to go?" she asked with a half smile on her face. Pointing the flashlight to the ground, Georgia's gaze followed, her smile quickly fading, her eyes narrowing with concern. "Is that blood?" she asked plainly. "I think so," I said, hearing a waver in my own voice. "There's a lot of it," Georgia added almost in a whisper. I could now see that the crimson trail was coming from behind the outhouse, and Georgia was right. There was a lot of it. I could tell that we were both nervous and just wanted to leave and go back to the campsite, but we also felt the need to see where the blood was coming from. We slowly crept around the side of the outhouse. When we rounded the corner, my heart almost stopped. It was Haley. Georgia let out a cry and stumbled backwards, immediately turning to throw up. I could hear her hyperventilating. I stood in place, my flashlight stuck on the horrific scene in front of me. Haley was face down in an unmoving heap on the ground, her blonde hair matted and stained with dirt and blood. There was a gaping hole at the back of her head. Beside her body sat a large rock covered in blood and matter. I could feel my stomach churn and something rise in my throat. I automatically took a few steps back softly, bumping into Georgia, who was still bent over, now dry heaving. Georgia, we need to get back to camp," I finally managed to spit out. Still staring at Haley's body, I blindly reached behind me to grab her. We clumsily stumbled back towards the camp, stunned and in complete silence. As we broke through into the clearing by the campfire, I looked around. I wasn't really sure what I was looking for, but I happened to notice the tent was open. I pointed my flashlight at it. Empty. Mel and Laura weren't inside. Shining the flashlight with one hand and gripping Georgia's shoulder with the other, I moved to sit her down by the fire pit. Her flashlight was still on, and I could see the beam of light vibrating, and she trembled and shook. I grabbed her a bottle of water and started looking around the site, trying to find some clue as to where Laura and Mel could have gone. I walked over to the tent and noticed a disturbance in the dirt on the ground. It was all kicked up, and there were shoe prints planted into the fresh soil. 2 sets. The shoe prints moved out of the campsite and towards the lake. One set was steady, while the other set looked sparse. Some spots had shoe prints, while other parts of the trail looked like drag marks. I didn't know what to do. I was in shock. I had a million thoughts running through my mind. Haley was dead. Georgia was in even more shock than me, stuck in a trance at the fire pit. Laura and Mel were missing, and these drag marks weren't giving me any comfort. I needed to follow these prints. What if someone was in trouble? What if... I was jolted out of my thoughts by the sound of frantic splashing. Without a second thought, I sprinted in the direction of the lake. I dashed through the trail, weaving around trees and skipping over roots and rocks. After a few minutes, I reached the crest of the trail before it sloped down to the water's edge and paused. In the midst of my stomping feet and heavy breathing, I hadn't noticed that the splashing had stopped. I stood at the top of the hill, and with a shaky breath, I moved my flashlight to illuminate the water at the bottom of the slope. I felt my blood turn to ice in my veins. I saw 2 figures, one standing about waist deep in the water, and one floating just below the surface. Mel's auburn hair almost glowed in the flashlight's beam, despite being shrouded in a layer of murky water. I let out a stifled cry. The other figure turned sharply and I almost cried out again. Laura's dark hair hung damp and tangled. Her skin looked gray and dull. Her eyes met mine and they shined like beacons, reflecting the light like cat's eyes. "Laura, oh my God, what did you do? What the hell is wrong with you?" She let go of Mel's still body and slowly turned around, now fully facing me. I felt a cold fear spreading through my body. After a tense moment, she let out an ugly snarl and charged at me. Her piercing eyes locked on me as she clawed through the water. I turned on my heel and took off back towards camp, hoping the water would slow her down. I had to get back to Georgia and we had to find our way out of here. Now. I ran as fast as I could, trying to ignore the burning sensation in my chest and the ringing in my ears. I could hear her charging up the hill, yelling and growling. I pushed on even harder. I burst into the clearing at camp and ran straight for Georgia. She was still sitting at the fire pit nursing her bottle of water, but jumped to her feet when she saw the state I was in. "Georgia, turn off your flashlight and run," I yelled at her. "Where's Mel and Laura?" she questioned. "Mel's gone," I whimpered. "It's Laura." Thankfully, she didn't question me any further. I think she understood. She flicked off her light, as did I, and we sprinted into the forest. I could still hear Laura crashing through the trees, but it seemed we had some distance between her and us. We had to find a place to hide or find our way back to the car. I tried spotting the trail markers, but it was so dark without the flashlights. We finally stumbled upon a pathway, so we were able to move a lot faster now. But I also realized that meant Laura would be moving faster too. After a few minutes of running, we hit a fork in the pathway. We stopped and looked at each other. Even in the pitch-black forest, I could see the tears streaming down George's face. I spun in circles, straining my eyes to see some sort of marker on the trees around us. Then I heard a faint whisper to my side. I whipped around and saw Georgia staring blankly at the ground. "This is all my fault, Soph. Haley and Mel are dead because of me. Laura is sick because of me. I dragged us all out here, this is all." But I cut her off. "Georgia, stop it. No one knew anything like this would happen. I'm sorry, but we have to go now," I urged. I took a hopeful guess of which path to take and I pulled her along behind me. As we continued running, I suddenly became aware that I didn't hear Laura anymore. A wave of anxiety washed over me. Had she given up chasing us, or was she hiding somewhere? I didn't want to stop to find out. I don't know how much longer we ran for, but I finally saw a break in the trees ahead of us. I couldn't help but cry out in relief. We stumbled across the parking lot to the car and I struggled to get the keys out of my jacket pocket as I ran around to the driver's side. I stood in front of the locked door and fumbled with them. My hands were shaking so violently from fear and exhaustion, I could barely keep myself from dropping them. I finally managed to find the unlock button and heard the locks click. We both ripped open the doors and climbed in. I jammed the key in the ignition and heard the car start. Thank God. But as I turned to close the door behind me, I heard Georgia let out a surprise scream. When I turned back, I saw a blur of Georgia's hair as she was violently pulled out of the car. I yelled out as I half climbed over the center console. Her flashlight clattered to the ground and Georgia's screams became muffled. I was able to look out the passenger door and saw Georgia laying on the pavement. Laura sat on top of her, pinning her down, with her hands wrapped tightly around Georgia's throat. I could hear Georgia trying to scream, and she was trying to fight back. She was kicking and scratching at Laura's arms and face, but it was no use. I continued climbing across the car to go and help her, but before I could get across the car, Laura began smashing Georgia's head on the pavement. I watched in terror as I heard several sickening cracks. Then Georgia went quiet and her arms dropped to the ground. I was frozen in place as I watched a pool of red start to seep out from under her head. Her bloodshot eyes were seemingly still locked on Laura, but the light in them was gone. A still moment passed. Then Laura slowly turned her head to me. Being closer to her, I could now see how sick she really looked. Her eyes were yellowed and there was blood streaming down her cheeks like tears. Actually, I could see blood coming from her nose and her ears too. She was drooling, and her breath sounded difficult and rattled with every inhale. I barely recognized the girl I was looking at. I saw her body shift to move towards me, and that sent me back into motion. I jumped back in the driver's seat and threw the car in reverse. The car flew backwards, the open doors swinging wildly. Once I had the space in front of me, I jammed the car into drive and took off with the tires squealing. As I was leaving the parking lot, I looked in my rearview mirror. I saw Georgia's body laying on the pavement, and Laura standing over her. She shot me one final glare, then turned and trudged back towards the forest. I sped down the road, not knowing what to do or where to go. I had no phone, no purse or supplies, nothing. Just myself and the car. I eventually came across a diner and they helped me call the police. It's now been a few days since this all happened. The police retrieved my items and recovered my friends' bodies. Thankfully, we were the only ones who booked a site in the area, so no one else was harmed. I'm back home now. I'm distraught and I can't stop crying. The guilt of being here while my best friends aren't is eating me alive. I haven't slept in days, and I'm sure part of that is because of what I'd just been through. But really, it's because of something else. They still haven't found Laura.